All right, Lee Smith
And Steve Kime.
from Blood and Iron Martial Arts, and today we are going to start our new talking series. We've had a lot of people ask us to do kind of this style of format, and so here it is. We're in homage to one of Canada's great shows, Coach's Corner. We're going to call this Coach's Couch.
No plagiarism intended.
None whatsoever. Just an homage to what was absolutely an icon of Canadian sports history.
Pretty much, yeah. Except none of us are going to be wearing turtlenecks.
And none of us have the style of Don Cherry, let's be honest.
Yeah, pretty much.
But your shirt's getting there.
Nothing wrong with my shirt. What you can expect from your first tournament.
And Steve and I are going to talk about the concepts. We might not always agree, but we're going to talk it through, and we'll go from there. We totally do not have whiskey in our glass.
No,
and
this
totally
is apple juice.
And it's totally not bareface. So we're going to start with like tournaments. They aren't necessarily for everyone. No. And what to expect in your first tournament is the first thing we're going to talk about is, are tournaments for you?
Pretty much. I mean, everybody gets into martial arts for different reasons. I personally had no intentions of going into competition. I found it to be a useful developmental tool, though. So not everyone goes into HEMA or goes into martial arts with the intention of going into competition. Some people do it for fitness. Some people do it because they saw it in a movie once and they thought it looked cool. So...
And, not everyone can handle the stress of competition. It is a stressful thing. The preparation, if you're going to be good and you're going to win, the preparation is stressful. The conditioning is stressful. Dealing with injuries is stressful. Dealing with your coach when something sucks 3 weeks before a tournament is extremely stressful. Finding out maybe that you're going to be pulled 1 week before a tournament due to a serious injury, also stressful.
Exactly. I mean, there's different stress levels in any kind of martial art based on what you do. Drilling is a set stress level. Sparring is an increased stress level. Tournament fighting is a much more increased stress level. Me personally, it took me about 3 years to acclimatize myself to the stress levels of competition. And it was not an easy road to travel.
Yeah, for Steve, for example, I coached him through that. And honestly, it was tough on him. Like there's a lot of times he wanted to give up. He wanted to quit. I mean, you'd see him in the sparring ring, and man, he looked awesome on the floor. He'd get the tournament ring, and he'd practically doing slow work. And this is due to stress. This is 100% stress. It has nothing to do with what he knows, what he can and cannot do. It's all due to the stress of the competitor. And he chose to do the hard road, which was work through it, which is really awesome. But again, it's not for everyone. Sometimes just the fun of sparring is good enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, and think of it as a developmental tool. We have only so many mediums to test how well we are at performing the drills we do, performing the techniques that we learn. I mean, you can't go out into the street and go on a duel. Nobody walks into a war or a battlefield with a longsword anymore.
So, we know of.
Well, yeah, that we know of. So, I mean, what do we have left? To test ourselves martially and to see if we're actually as good as we think we are with it.
And on the topic of tournaments aren't for everyone, let's go to the next part. It's disappointment. I mean, you're not going to win. It's unlikely you're going to win your first tournament. It's unlikely you're going to win the first series of tournaments. Mm-hmm. And people who compete, they often have a really high standard for themselves. And dealing with a disappointment, maybe you got a bad call. It was down to one hit. Maybe you didn't perform the way you thought you would perform. Maybe your training in a specific area was weak. I mean, you're going to come out, and if you didn't win, you're going to be disappointed. Or maybe, you won badly. That happens too. And, you look at your after-fight footage and be like, damn, that looks like ass.
And dealing with disappointment is extremely important. And a good coach will be able to help someone through disappointing performance at a tournament. And I mean, you could have a disappointing performance in your first tournament. You could have a disappointing performance in your 10th tournament. It's going to happen. So it's best to understand that this is something you're going to have to deal with in your martial arts career.
I would actually argue, Steve, that if you're in a winning streak, I mean, that disappointment is going to be higher and higher. That level is going to be higher and higher the more wins you have in a row, because you're accustomed to winning. And when someone takes you down a peg, it's a long way to fall.
It really is. And I mean, it happens in any martial art. To reference UFC, one of the more recent fights between Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje. Ferguson had come off a 20-fight win streak, and Gaethje just took him to town. So, I mean, you have to think about how he's feeling. Does he continue his career? He's obviously an extremely skilled fighter, but he'd been beaten, whereas he had gone on one of the longest winning streaks prior to that. So It happens at any point in your career. You're going to have a bad day. You're going to have a bad performance at some point.
The next thing I talk about, anxiety. You are going to have tournament anxiety. You can look as cool as a cucumber inside. You're in a final, Albion sword on the line, you're going to feel anxious. And it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to feel anxious. It doesn't matter if you are essentially the coldest guy in the room, totally cool under pressure. When the heat's on and there's something on the line of value that you want, you're going to feel anxiety. You're going to feel social pressure. If you don't win, maybe people won't look at you the same way. If you do win, maybe they won't look at you the same way. You don't know.
And it's hard to find ways to cope with this. Everybody kind of develops their own way of coping with things. Sometimes it happens organically on its own throughout the course of your career, like it did with me. And sometimes you need someone to help you find kind of that way to cope with the anxiety. Again, speaking from my own experience, when I get worked up and I get overhyped, I actually get Lee to slap me in the face.
It's a weird thing, but I do it because you know what? He's my guy, right? He's the guy. He's my student in a lot of ways. Now he's more my peer. But you know, when I'm in his corner, I'm his coach. And if the athlete wants something bizarre like that from me, I'm like, yes, sir, no problem. I'm there to serve him, right?
Yeah, and a good coach will do that for their student. They will be there for them and ask them what they want and what they need. And that was something that I discovered for myself, that evens me out. It brings me down to even playing field. It calms me down, I guess you could say. It's kind of a bit of a release of anxiety that way.
You know what's funny about that, though, is I did have someone walk to be a tournament after I slapped you. And they're like, I don't think it's appropriate you slap your students. I'm like, that was his request. And they looked at me and they just walked off. They didn't know what to say. Mm-hmm. I'm like, it's his request, man. I'm just doing what he asked. They thought I was actually beating you like I was some kind of strange Russian sport fencing coach.
Yeah. No, I mean, it works. It works. Now, I mean, I wouldn't recommend trying that with your students if you're an instructor out there. This is something I discovered for myself, and everybody has different ways of coping with anxiety. Everybody has different ways.
Consent's very important here, guys. Yeah. It's a very important thing to note.
Yeah. Not recommending you go out and slap your students.
Yes.
Really not.
So, and then we start looking at wrong mindset. Wrong mindset is going to happen to the best fighters. You're going to come in, maybe you had a bad day. Maybe you were in unfamiliar country. You drank bad water, right? Maybe you just woke up on the wrong side of the bed. You don't know, right?
Maybe you had too much to drink the night before and you didn't realize it.
Right? Maybe you had a serious family problem, right, that you're dealing with the night before. Wrong mindset happens to everyone. And how you deal with that is how you overcome this kind of idea in the tournament mentality. So, but you have to expect it's going to happen. You don't know before you go to a tournament. You don't know what you're going to walk into.
Yeah, there's lots of things in a tournament that you cannot control. The environment you're walking into, what your mindset's going to be the day of the tournament is one of those things. Life just happens sometimes.
Yeah,
and it's not always pleasant.
Yeah, exactly. So wrong mindset is going to happen. And then, of course, tying this all in, too high expectations.
One of the things I tell people who I train as well, and I learned this from Lee, is if they're walking into their first tournament, think of it as your baseline. This is where your starting point is. And your goal shouldn't be to win the tournament. Your goal should be to do better in your next tournament than you did in this one. Because regardless of how you place or where you medal or if you succeed on a grand scale, as long as you've done better than you did before, that's an improvement. And that's always what you should really strive for, in my opinion.
Even then, you should be looking at your fight videos and being like, you know what? I could do better here. I could do better there. That's also why you have a coach team. You have people you trust going over your videos, and then they're giving you feedback. And I mean, I have a great team, people that I trained to do that for me. But at the same time, I mean, it's never good enough. I could have a perfect match and it still would never be good enough. I'd look at my footwork and be like, that looks bad. I'd look at some handwork. Even if it was looked like the perfect handwork, I'd look and be like, wrist position's a half inch off. I mean, that's just me. I'm my own worst critic.
It's actually a very dangerous mindset to get into. It's good enough.
It's not, yeah.
It's a very dangerous mindset because at that point you're stifling any possibility of improvement
and growth.
It should never be good enough. There should always be room for improvement. One of the things a previous boss of an employer of mine told me is, on evaluations, she would never give a perfect score because a perfect score indicates that there's no room for improvement. So the highest you'll ever get with her was 9 out of 10. And it's actually a really healthy mindset to think of your performance as, you can think of it as good, you can be proud of your performance, but you should always look at it as something to improve upon. Because that way you never stop improving, and you'll always get better, and you'll always do better the next time because you'll be willing to put the work in.
So another thing we need to talk about from a coach perspective is your fighter. And a lot of that comes down to fighter and athlete psychology. So it plays a big part. As the things we already discussed, as your fighter going through this, as a coach, you have to be able to detect this stuff. And you have to be able to know what they're going through to get the best result of your athlete. And I mean, when I say it's big, it's big. It's like your fighter, you could be coaching a female fighter, she could be menstruating. That could be a thing. It could be throwing her off, right? Unless you have an open relationship where you talk these things through, you're never going to know. And then you'll know afterwards and be like, okay, that made sense. Someone might have died recently in their family. If you don't know that, you don't know how to kind of get them to do their best considering the situation, right? Perhaps they're injured and they're hiding it from you. This is another thing you have to consider.
Pride.
Because a lot of people, like myself included, I'm also guilty of this, will hide an injury to compete. If you detect that injury, as a coach, you kind of should, you gotta let the fighter do what they're gonna do, but at the same time, if it's really bad, you're gonna have to pull them. And that's just the ethics behind it. And fighters will hide their injuries, they'll hide their stresses, their emotional trauma, everything else from you so they can compete. They put lots of work in. Of course they're gonna do it. They paid for flights. I mean, when you think of this, if you think of it, right, no one wants to cancel their flight or just go and not compete after they put 3 months of work in.
Exactly. And as an athlete, you have to understand that your coach isn't doing this out of any degree of spite. It's about, they care about you. They want you to succeed, but they don't want you to break yourself to the point where you can never advance. So it's a form of protecting you and at the same time trying to make sure that you're safe enough to actually compete at your highest level. It's not personal. It's not in any way, shape, or form personal.
And now we go, different people have different needs. And this is a really important one to remember. Like, I can coach Steve one way, but I could definitely not coach Nicole the same way. So to give you an example, Steve likes me in his corner. He likes me kind of warming up a little bit beforehand. Gets a slap in the face. Steve has this routine. He'll do very well. If I'm not in his corner, or Jesse's not in his corner, he tends to do a little more poorly. He does well with Nicole in his corner too. Like, he has very particular people he likes in his corner. Whereas I look at Nicole, I can't even be in the same room. I can coach her on the floor up into tournament. And the second tournament happens, I cannot be in the room where she can see me. Otherwise, she just won't perform. It's just part of her fighter psychology. And that's part of respecting that, right? I may teach her. I may be the head coach of my club. And I may build up her techniques, analyze stuff, and then give it to people to give to her. But if I'm the one giving that directive, she completely shuts down.
And every fighter and every athlete is going to respond to different levels of stimulus. I respond very positively to hard line approaches. Just the God's honest truth right from the get-go with nothing held back. That works very well with me, but it won't work very well with certain other people. So it's, as Lee said, it's important to find out what kind of stimulus gets the best reaction from your athlete as a coach.
Well, that's exactly it. Now, here's a really good example. Now this is going to be weird, but a less skilled fighter can win, right, due to better fight psychology. And this is a really important one. A less skilled fighter can win due to better fight psychology. Now, what do I mean by that? You can have a really talented, a really high skill fighter, particularly in weapons combat. And I mean, there was an instance where a person of much higher skill fought one of our guys who had just started his career. And I mean, he wasn't particularly good at the time. He had about 4 shots. He did pretty well. But man, his fight psychology was outstanding. He's just indomitable, great spirit, really strong. And he was fighting an instructor, someone he was teaching him. And he beat them. And he beat them very solidly because his fighter psychology was just better than the other person's. And this is a really This is a powerful thing because once he had beaten them mentally, it didn't matter how good their game was. It was over. It's finished.
And it's important to understand as well that a good mindset can overcome physical barriers really, really easily.
Yeah.
It works both ways as well. A really bad mindset can stifle physical barriers too and make you perform less than what you're capable of. Whereas a really good mental attitude and a good mindset going into a fight, you can push yourself quite hard.
It's true. And Steve's completely right. Which leads us into why we do tournaments, right? Now, we've listed a lot of negative stuff. Why do we do it? Well, it's about testing your boundaries. So once you understand that this is what you're going to have in your first tournament, now, if you go in with the right attitude, that you're there to learn, you're there to build on yourself, well, and you understand that your performance is solely about you and solely about your team and the holistic idea of bettering yourself in your fight game, well, now you're in probably for a really good experience, regardless of how you place. Because then you can walk into the tournament, you can be like, have a realistic expectation of what you're doing. You can have a stronger idea of where you want to go, and you can use it as a learning tool.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of the most potent learning tools. You go into a tournament and you perform a technique that you've practiced maybe 300 times, and you do it well, and you land it successfully. It's an amazing feeling. And like the first time I experienced that was at a tournament in the U.S. I had done very poorly throughout the pools of the tournament, and I had just managed to squeak by into the eliminations because somebody had to drop out due to injury. So like that was a sign. And one of my coaches came up to me and said, "You just got to stop caring so much."
That was me.
That was both Lee and Nicole that said that
you
to
did
me,
too?
actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And that kind of remark got me thinking. I, at that point, accepted that I'd done poorly enough that I probably wasn't going to place, and that I should just focus on what I was doing in my next fight and ignore everything else. And that was my turning point right there. My investment was in the match and not in the concept of victory. If you focus on the here, like for me personally, if you focus on the here and now, and everything else becomes it becomes background noise, then you will do better because you're living in the now. You're not thinking about the future and what might happen. You're focusing on what you have power over, which was my next match. And I ended up doing exceptionally well. So that's one of my experiences with that concept.
I would actually argue that was the real turning point in your career, actually.
It probably was. That was probably the real turning point, was when I started to be able to do well in tournaments after that one match. But yeah, no, that was a big turning point for me. And that's when I realized I found my mental game, and it continued to develop from there. So
when you go to a tournament for your first time, like we start looking at what to expect, don't expect anything. The best advice here about testing your boundaries is do your best, learn from experience, move forward.
The biggest thing I can also add to that is don't think of your opponents. Think of you're going there with only one opponent in mind, and that's yourself. And your goal here is to develop yourself. So, like I said before, your first tournament should be your baseline. Everything else after that is an improvement on how you were before. And that's your biggest opponent, is yourself.
So let's move on to setting realistic expectations. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what we had already touched on. But when you go to tournament, go in with a good mindset. Like, set a realistic expectation. You trained really hard. You know who's going to be there. I mean, say, like, I would like to win one match. If you're his first tournament, I want to win one match. That's a realistic expectation.
Yeah, and it's incredibly accomplishable. Something that you can accomplish should be your first goal. It's setting goals is great, but set ones that you know you can accomplish, particularly when you don't have the experience of going into a tournament. Winning a single match is a great starting point for setting goals. And then you can get to something more lofty, like, I want to win a gold medal. That's a very lofty goal.
Well, I think that's a pretty big jump.
Yeah, it's a pretty big jump, particularly for someone with not a lot of tournament experience. Because your goals should really be something more than what they were before. If you accomplish your goal, set a slightly higher one. And then continue to do that until you get to a point where you can say, my next goal is to win a gold medal.
I mean, we could even go back one step and be like, I'd like to land a proper Zwerk in a tournament. That's a little harder than winning a match, but if you want to land this work properly in a tournament, maybe that's a good goal to set it to, right? Because then you're breaking your mentality, you're breaking your mindset, and you're trying to make a technique work under duress against a completely unwilling opponent.
Exactly.
And it's not like you can do that in real life. I mean, you can't say, I'm going to go duel some guy.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
So, I mean, tournament is about as close as you're going to get to it.
Yeah.
So expect that. I'm going to try to land this work. I'm going to try to land this shield how. So.
Exactly. Goals of any kind, something you can accomplish. Biggest thing, particularly in the onset.
Learning from a loss. This is another thing you have to expect to do in tournament. Maybe you had a bad loss in the pools and you won the tournament, but you can still learn from that loss. You can go watch your fight video. You can say, hey, wow, that sucked. And you can move forward.
Yeah. I mean, losing or failing. Failure is the best teacher because it tells you where your limits are and it tells you what you can shoot for next. I've lost a lot of matches and each one of them taught me a lesson. You will learn more from failure than you will from victory. Victory will keep you going forward. Failure will tell you what you've done wrong. And it should always be something you learn from. Don't be so disappointed in a failure that it makes you not want to continue to try and improve.
Because you don't really know what that other guy's prep was. Maybe he's more experienced. Maybe his prep was better than yours. Maybe he trained harder, right? You don't know what this person
He could be a more physically gifted athlete.
Yeah, he could just be a better athlete. This person could just be better than you at this. Usually what happens is a loss tends to happen at the hands of someone who's more prepared and just is better at it than you. Perhaps it might even doesn't hurt to contact that person and ask them for some tips. A lot of people are really cool. They'll be like, yeah, no problem.
I've certainly done that more than once. In fact, fun story. One tournament I was at, I was a single stick tournament. I fought an instructor from another club and he beat me. He beat me very cleanly. I met him at the bar the next that evening and we talked about the match. I asked him what his opinions were and he gave me some advice. And lo and behold, I happened to face him again in the eliminations. So what did I do? I used all the advice he'd given me when I fought him, and I won. So in essence, he kind of told me how to beat him. So you'll run into experiences like this all the time. And it wasn't necessarily what I placed in that tournament that gave me the most satisfaction. It was the fact that I was able to use something that somebody told me in a 15-minute conversation, and it helped me improve. And I still do that when I spar today. Because it was good, sound, solid advice. And it helped me win a match.
And I mean, the next thing you can think about, and really the last thing we should touch on, is judging, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have good judges, you're going to have bad judges, you're going to have good rules, and you're going to have bad rules. So judging and rule sets. Yeah. And really that's really a question of what do you want? We'll start with the judges because that's not really a question of what you want.
No.
Judges are volunteers.
Yes.
Period and stop. I don't know of a single tournament, maybe things have changed recently, but I don't know of a single tournament where judges are actually paid fairly for the hours they put in.
And it is a thankless job. You will get berated. If you're a judge in a tournament, I applaud you because it is an incredibly thankless job. Everybody will tell you what you're doing wrong. Nobody will applaud you for doing it correctly. So it's actually a very unfair position to be placed in, to be honest, but it's necessary.
And, okay, well, think of this. We didn't have judges. What we have, right? We have honor-based tournaments, which, I mean, that has its own set of problems we won't even get into, right?
Yeah.
You see that in the SCA.
That's an entire video in itself.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I will say that when you look at a good judging ratio in HEMA, we see is about 60-65% is really good.
70% is exceptional.
But it doesn't happen everywhere.
Yeah.
You need a really well-trained judge team to get that to happen, and you need rule sets which promote clear striking.
And let's face it, people need to be honest about what they see.
Yeah.
And not everyone is. So.
But, here's the thing. As long as you accept that when you enter a tournament, the best you're going to get is 60-40, well, that's the best we got for right now.
And I mean, you can use that as a means of training yourself to compete in that tournament. Make your shots as clean as possible so there's no possible way the judge could misinterpret something.
That goes back to what Rob Childs told me when I first started. And he's like, hit, don't be hit.
Exactly.
I mean, it's pretty hard then.
It even says that in the manuals.
Yeah, hit, don't be hit. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, bad judging is going to happen. Good judging is going to happen. You just come to expect it. Terrible judging is going to happen. Yeah. But I mean, after a while, You can see the tournaments you want to enter in that sense, where the good judges are going to be, where the bad judges are going to be.
And the only thing that will teach you this is experience. So don't be discouraged from entering a tournament if you're expecting poor judging. Poor judging is going to happen.
And if you're really competitive and you can't handle the bad judges, then just don't go.
Yeah. But again, you need the experience to be able to make that call.
And that's not in your first tournament. You aren't going to know. That's like 10, 15 tournaments down the line.
Yeah. And this boils back to the whole concept of don't be discouraged by a failure, because there's any number of things that could lead to that failure. And one of those is poor judging.
But before you even cast all the judges off, just realize that these people are volunteers. Number one. 2, judge training throughout schools is not consistent.
No.
So remember, judging is a thankless job, and you're going to see good and bad judges. Now, with that said, I can't stress enough for you to realize these people are volunteers. And a lot of these people don't have proper judge training. In fact, nobody's really developed proper judge training.
It's true. It's a scarce skill level. It really is. And the other thing you have to consider is judging is exhausting. It's mentally draining. So the longer judges will be officiating a tournament, the less they're going to see. Because unless you have enough staff in an event to be able to cycle out your judges so everyone's fresh, which doesn't happen often because not a lot of people volunteer to be judges.
It never really happens, to be honest.
I myself have been at a tournament event for 14 plus hours, judging tournaments, marshalling tournaments, and competing in tournaments.
Just remember, too, your judges are also sometimes competing in different events also.
Yeah.
So they're already exhausted beyond belief. So, I mean, thank your judges, buy them a beer, right?
Exactly.
And you know what? That will go a long way for when you have to judge, because inevitably, if you decide to continue tournaments after your first one, you're inevitably going to have to judge. That's just how it is.
At some point, it's going to be needed. And whether or not you decide to take that mantle, it's up to you.
Or your club tells you you're doing it, which is the case in our club.
Yep.
You don't really have a choice. You're helping with something in the club. If you're competing, you're helping.
Yep. It's one of the requirements of being on our competition team is you will, if we're running a tournament, you're judging.
To be honest with you, if I see some layabouts in our club doing nothing too, I will also tell them to go do stuff if I'm around the ring. Yeah. I'm a little harder than Steve is with this, but I have a thing. If you're going to enjoy, then you should have to put a bit of work in so other people can enjoy too.
Absolutely.
Many hands make light work. And the next thing to talk about, rule sets.
Not all rule sets are good. Not all rule sets encourage martial tactics, martial performance. Some rule sets are geared towards sporting, touching and not really rotating into cuts, flat strikes. They're all different. There is no consistency in rule sets these days.
As you can see, Steve is quite biased on this, so am I. But I'll take a more averaged approach, a more general approach to this. Realistically, you're going to choose a type of tournament that you want to enter, right? If your preference is touch tournaments and tip taps and little scratches and stuff, and you want to make quick hits, you don't care about the martial validity, then, I mean, there's lots of those out there too. If you do care about the martial validity of your strikes, then those tournaments are, like Steve and I do, then those tournaments are in shorter supply. So it all depends on what you want out of your tournament. Do you want the quick flat tip tap? Sure.
My advice would be is read the rule set thoroughly before going to any tournament or deciding to spend the money to go to a tournament. If you have friends who've had experience with tournaments, consult them. Ask them what their opinions are. In all likelihood, they'll have more experiences that would give you a better idea if this is something you want to pursue.
Yeah. Also, tournaments are more fun as a club. If you have a group, go with a group.
Yeah.
You'll have a good time regardless, normally.
Yeah. And go with the intention of having a good time. Don't think of it in any other degree than that. Have fun with it. Your development will come because of the experience you have in the tournament. And it should be a positive one, regardless of a poor rule set or poor judging. So go with the intention of having a good time.
And that is our first edition of Coach's Couch.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Cheers.